The Vestal Virgins were among the most mysterious, revered, and strictly controlled figures in ancient Rome, and their role blended religion, politics, superstition, and public welfare in ways that no other Roman office did. To understand who they were, you have to imagine a city where religion wasn't just belief, but infrastructure, reputation, and survival. Rome believed its power depended on the favor of the gods, and few duties were considered more sacred than maintaining that divine approval. The Vestal Virgins stood at the center of this belief, holding a job that was at once prestigious, terrifying, privileged, and relentlessly demanding. They were priestesses of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, and their primary responsibility was to maintain the sacred fire inside the temple of Vesta. Romans believed this fire symbolized the eternal life of the state. If it ever went out, it wasn't merely a religious mistake, it was a sign that the gods had withdrawn their protection. So Rome placed a task in the hands of girls sworn to chastity, discipline, and absolute dedication. The Vestals were chosen young, usually between 6 and 10 years old, plucked from noble families in a process that resembled both an honor and a kidnapping. Parents couldn't refuse if their daughter was selected, and the chosen girl was removed from her household and legally adopted into the sacred college of priestesses. Her father no longer had authority over her. Instead, she became a daughter of the state. From that moment on, her life was controlled entirely by religious law. She entered a 30-year commitment divided into 3 10-year phases: learning, performing, and teaching. During their early years, new Vestals studied rituals, memorized prayers, and learned the intricacies of caring for sacred objects. The second decade was the heart of their service, when they performed rituals, tended the fire, and took part in ceremonies. The final decade was spent training newcomers, ensuring the traditions continued unbroken. Their responsibilities went far beyond keeping a flame alive. The Vestals guarded sacred objects stored within the circular temple of Vesta, including the mysterious Pignora Imperi, items believed to guarantee the safety of Rome. No one knows exactly what these objects were. Ancient writers hint at things like the Palladium, a statue of Athena said to have been carried from Troy. Because these relics were seen as protective talismans for the entire state, the trust placed in the Vestals was enormous. They also made sacred salt cakes called mola salsa, used in almost every Roman sacrifice, meaning that no major religious ritual in Rome could proceed without something the Vestals created. The Vestals had unusual legal privileges for women in Rome. They controlled their own property, could free condemned prisoners with a touch, and had front-row seats at public games. They even had the privilege of mobilities, something rare for Roman women, because they could travel freely and were escorted by lictors, officers usually assigned only to high-ranking magistrates. When a Vestal walked through Rome, crowds parted before her. If someone sentenced to death encountered a Vestal by accident, the person was immediately pardoned. Their presence alone was considered lucky, their absence unlucky. They had no father, no husband, and no male guardian. Their authority came directly from Rome's deepest religious traditions. Yet these freedoms came at the cost of strict, suffocating expectations. Chastity was the center of everything. The purity of a Vestal was believed to reflect the purity of the Roman state. If a Vestal violated her vow of celibacy, Rome feared disaster, failed harvests, military losses, plague. And so the punishment was disturbing even by Roman standards. Because shedding the blood of a Vestal was forbidden, she could not be executed in a normal way. Instead, a guilty Vestal was buried alive. She would be taken to a small underground chamber with a couch, a lamp, and a little food and water, and there she would be sealed away until she died. The man involved was publicly beaten to death. Even innocent mistakes carried danger. If the sacred fire went out, the responsible Vestal was flogged, regardless of her age. The pressure on these girls was immense. A lapse in concentration could lead to public humiliation. A lapse in virtue could lead to death. Yet despite the darkness that hung over their vows, the Vestals were treated with enormous respect. They represented an ideal of discipline and sacrifice that Romans admired. Their presence was essential at major state ceremonies, including treaties, wills, and official documents. Archives were often entrusted to them, including important legal papers and even the wills of generals and emperors. Julius Caesar's will, for example, was kept in the care of the Vestals. Their temple was not merely sacred space. It was also a repository of political power. Their relationship to the Roman state became especially visible during crises. When Hannibal threatened Rome during the Second Punic War, the Vestals were some of the first to evacuate the city to protect the sacred fire. Later, during political upheaval, rebels sometimes tried to seize them, recognizing the symbolic power they carried. The Vestals embodied Rome's moral foundation. If they faltered, Rome believed the city itself was at risk. Daily life for a Vestal was a strange mix of privilege and restriction. They lived in the house of the Vestals, a large complex beside the Roman Forum. Here they slept, ate, studied, and performed their duties. Surrounded by attendants and protected by strict rules, they were watched constantly, not because they were prisoners, but because Rome believed their safety and purity were matters of national survival. Their interactions with outsiders were controlled, and although they could be seen in public, they had to behave with ritual dignity at all times. Still, compared to typical Roman women, they lived unusual lives of independence. They could own property, write wills, and move freely without escort from family. Some Vestals became influential figures, shaping political decisions through quiet persuasion. After completing their 30 years, a Vestal was allowed to retire, something no other major priesthood offered. Retired Vestals could marry, though many did not. Some may have preferred the independence they had grown accustomed to. Those who did marry often found wealthy, powerful husbands, because marrying a former Vestal was considered extremely auspicious. Retirement also came with a generous pension from the state. Yet, despite this, some ancient writers suggest that the transition from sacred life to ordinary life could be emotionally difficult, as the Vestals had spent decades in a world set apart from normal Roman society. Despite their symbolic power, the Vestals ultimately didn't survive the rise of Christianity. In the 4th century CE, the Christian emperors began dismantling Rome's pagan institutions. In 391 CE, Theodosius I officially disbanded the priesthood of the Vestal Virgins and extinguished the sacred fire, which had supposedly burned for nearly 1,000 years. The temple became a ruin. What had once been the spiritual heart of Rome became an archaeological site. But the image of the Vestal Virgin, disciplined, serene, dedicated entirely to the welfare of the stately guard, in Roman memory and later Western imagination. The Vestal Virgins lived lives defined by extremes: extreme honor, extreme danger, extreme trust, and extreme scrutiny. They were both symbols and functionaries, celebrities and servants, respected and feared, privileged yet constrained. Their job was to protect Rome's spiritual lifeline, and by doing so, they became some of the most fascinating figures in ancient history. Their story reveals a culture where religion and government were inseparable, where girls could wield astonishing authority, and where superstition and politics intertwined with everyday life. Even after centuries, the idea of these silent priestesses tending an eternal fire still carries a kind of mythic power, a reminder of how deeply the Romans believed that the fate of their world rested in human hands, specifically in the hands of a small group of devoted women who kept a flame alive.